Hey everyone, and welcome to Read This Now, the weekly webcast where Brad Gustafson and I share two books that we love and we think you should read when, Brad?
Right now.
Wow, that was
I can't
so
wait
serious.
For the playback. I'm going to go back and analyze because it felt cool. It felt cool, but I'll go see.
It felt so serious. I was like, okay, Mr. Gustafson. Okay, Dr. Gustafson, I'll do it right now.
No, but of course you'll want to read them now because they're amazing, right?
Well, with that said, then why don't you kick us off by sharing a book that we will want to read right now, darn it.
All right. I felt like a kid in a candy store this past week because a lot of times when I travel, I just bring books from home, but I actually went into the airport store and I'm going to buy a book in the airport and maybe pay twice as much as I should for it. But anyway, so I'm looking at the shelves and it literally felt like a kid in a candy store. And I found one that jumped out at me. And I don't know if it's because you've talked about it before, or maybe it's because my kids have it home, or maybe it's a combination of both. But this is the book. This is the book that I picked out last week at the airport and thoroughly enjoyed and was just on kind of the edge of my seat as I was reading. It is called One of Us is Lying. Have you talked about this on the show before, Jen?
No, if I ever have talked about it on the show, but I have read it. So I know exactly what I know exactly that feeling. So go on.
Okay. So this is a prime example of a book that I'm not prepared to recommend to elementary kids, but maybe like college or if you're over 30, because there might be a swear word or
Sorry, you know, Brad, I hate to be the one to break this to you, but there are ages between elementary and college. There are
I know. I actually was like, I don't want to say I was lecturing my kiddo on it, but she had read it and then I was reading it. I'm like, oh my gosh, some of this stuff is like deals with real life. And she's like, I know, Dad, like, duh, Dad. And anyway, I had to connect with her on some of this stuff. But anyway,
what I love, this just like cracks me up. Go on. I'm sorry.
I know. Welcome to my world. What I loved about the book was it probably, as the title implies, you have four, high school aged kids and somebody dies at their school and they're all in the room, detention actually, when it happens. So logic would say somebody in that room is responsible, like murder. Somebody did it. And it's really cool to weave through each high school student's point of view and just hear about their life and how they're relating to friends and navigating the pressures and how it felt like a movie that I was watching because the author did such a masterful job of shifting your doubts to every character and then broadening and then zooming in on some. And of course, probably I would assume as we're reading mysteries, if that's what this is, we all are trying to guess and read between lines and figure out like where am I trying to be steered. So I was trying to do that the whole time, and for the life of me, I couldn't figure it out. But it was so rich and cool and smart and relevant and funny and real, and for all those reasons, as long as you're like over 30, you should read this right now. Just kidding on that age part.
I love it so much. Let me tell you a story. When you were talking about this book, it brought me back and reminded me so much of my friend Tara Seletska. I'm shouting out to her, who is a middle school librarian in Vancouver, Washington. And I don't know if she still does, but she used to run this like murder mystery, true crime, or like murder mystery book club, because she found that there were some kids that she knew in her school who didn't necessarily like to check out books, but talked about how they were fans of like true crime podcasts and that kind of stuff. And she connected with them on that level. And so she started this book club for people who were fans of that genre, but maybe had never found books that they really loved. And she included kids, and she included teachers, and she included parents, and they would come and gather in this back room of the library. And she had like a whole suspect board up on the one side, and as they would read these books together, and one of them was One of Us is Lying, that's why I remember it, she would like record all the clues on the board, and she'd have little cutouts for the suspects, and they'd move them on a list as who was higher up on the suspect list as they would read further and stuff. And I remember these like adults and these kids finding like a home in the library and in books maybe for the first time, because they got to read stuff that was really of interest to them, as opposed to maybe stuff that was assigned for school that didn't feel as relevant to them. And I just remember sitting in that room when she was talking about that book and going, oh my gosh, I have to read this book now. Like, it was so compelling to me. And I remember reading it and feeling the exact same way you did, and like texting Tara and going, who's going to move up on our suspect board, and so on and so forth. And it was just so neat. It's one of those like edge of your seat books for sure.
Okay, so what you just described and the colleague you shared, that sounds so cool. It made me think of how fun would it be to read in small like detective groups, like maybe me and you, but then just everyone agree like, okay, after page 200, we're going to stop, and that's your initial evidence. And then you just try to see what you can do, and then everyone gets 100 more pages, and then and then you have to do your findings and you talk as a class. How fun would that be?
Brad, remember the game Clue? Do you remember the game Clue?
Yes. Oh yeah.
Where you put your guesses in the envelope? Like, it would be like that. Like, we would have a 100-page envelope, and people would put their guesses in, and we seal that and save it till the end. Then 200 pages, people put their guesses in, and we seal that and save it to the end. Like, we could do it just like Clue.
You know what we should do? We should do like a online book club and just pick out a really great mystery and just host it. And if it's 1 or 2 or 3 or maybe more people want to join us, how fun would that be?
That would be so fun. And we'll have to figure out a digital way for 100 pages for people to send in their sealed guesses for us to reveal at the end. We're gonna have to figure this out.
So fun. And I'll say one other thing about Clue. I was the guy in Clue, still am. Like, I would be sitting and taking so many notes. Like, people are like, what are you doing? Are you writing a book or are you playing Clue? But that's just how I play the game.
Like that, who would make a grid, and she would like have like things across the top and things across the side with the different characters and where they were, the clues, and she'd be Xing people off so she could fine tune and decide. She's really good at Clue, but she had a whole system for it. I love it. Well, I think we're on to something. I think we're on to something. It's going to be called our like Colonel Mustard in the library with the Candlestick Book Club or something.
I love that. Oh my gosh.
Love it. Well, I don't even feel like I need to share a book today because I'm just so.
I know, you've literally got me in a happy place, Jen. Thank you.
I do want to share a book today, though, because it wouldn't be our show if I didn't. But although my book is a real hard left turn from yours, and I don't think we're going to come up with a fun game for it afterwards. But that didn't change how much I really love this book and really want to share it, because I feel like it's a book that a lot of people need to know about. It's a novel in verse. I'm going to grab it real fast. And I want to show this beautiful cover first. I don't know about you, Brad, but I just like respond to that artwork with the waves like that and the silhouette coming out of it. I don't know. There's something really evocative to me about this cover. I was really drawn to it to begin with. But the reason I read it is because one of my students at Rutgers said, you have to read this book. And so I picked it up as a result of that. And as I said, it's a novel in verse, and I found it fascinating. And I really thought about you, Brad, when I was reading it, because I know how much you love historical fiction. And I felt like, gosh, I learned so much about history through this book that I didn't know about before. I'm guessing I'm not alone that, over the last couple of years, many of us have learned for the first time about the very first slave ship that came to the United States called the White Lion. That book was, that ship was featured and centered in the work of the 1619 Project in all of its different forms. But this book is about a different slave ship called the Clotilda, which was actually the very last slave ship to ever come to America. And it has this fascinating story because it was actually chartered illegally by a man who placed a bet with members of his community that he couldn't bring 100 slaves back to the United States, enslaved people back to the United States, He bet them $1,000 that he could do that, even though slavery had been outlawed and bringing slaves to the United States was now against the law. So the whole thing happened because of a bet. And the story chronicles what it was like, life was like for the enslaved people before they were captured, and then what life was like on the journey back to America on the Clotilda. But then it takes this, I mean, the whole thing is fascinating from page 1 to the end. But one thing that this book does that I've never seen before, and this was the part of history that was so fascinating to me, is that after these enslaved people make it to the America, the Civil War breaks out not that long after that, and they suddenly find themselves free. And by free, it means that they're not technically owned by anyone anymore, but they have no money, they have no property, it's illegal for them to work, all this stuff. And based on the real events that happen, several of them band together, are able to purchase some land from their former enslaver and start the first African settlement in Alabama known as Africantown, because they wanted to like sort of create a lighthouse, if you will, to use like sort of a sea metaphor, for other Africans who had been brought to America against their will, so that they would know that this was a place that they belonged. Sorry, my dog's barking in the background. And one of the things that was so fascinating is that one of the people whose name is escaping me now, but who the story centers around, actually was known for many years and interviewed by journalists and stuff at the turn of the 20th century, was actually chronicled to be what people believe the last living, like the last person brought over here as an enslaved person to live the longest, like the last living enslaved person, and whose journey was well chronicled. And so the authors of this story used everything we knew about him and his family to reconstruct this journey from Africa to Africantown. And this man lived to be in his 90s, had many children, and set up this whole settlement with which apparently still exists to this day. And what is so cool is one of the things I know you and I both love about historical fiction is that this book is full of back matter. There's lots of author's notes and stuff in the back that at the end of the book to help us understand who the real people were, where Africantown is located, what happened to people after the book ends, all sorts of cool stuff. And the other thing I'll just say about this book that I love before I'll end is that there's 14 different characters in it, including the ship. The ship gets to be a narrator in the book as well. And because it's a novel in verse, what's really neat is that the authors chose a different poetic form for each character. So not only do you see the character's name, say, at the top of the page, but different characters, their poems are written in different ways. So when we return to some characters just visually on the page, we recognize that it's that character because we can see, like, for example, William's poems are always left justified. And so you just recognize visually that this is a different character. I think it's a really cool book. It's gotten a lot of starred reviews already this year. And it just came out in January, I believe. It's called Africantown. And it also, let me just say one last thing. I keep saying it's the last thing, but I promise this is that it reminded me so much of one of my favorite books ever, which was The Watch That Ends the Night by Alan Wolfe, which was another novel in verse that chronicled the journey of the Titanic, because I loved the way that they personified the ship and how the ship had all these struggles on its way back to America. And the way they personified that was like the ship trying to rebel against the slavers, who were using it for these ill-begotten purposes. So it's called Africantown, and it's by Irene Latham and Charles Waters, and I think you should read it right now.
Absolutely amazing. Here's what I've kind of learned within the last couple months. I read Lisa Phipps's Starfish, and I think I had noticed subconsciously before, but her book, it hit me how much an author can pack into seemingly less words. It just felt like there was so much there. So as you were talking about all these perspectives in verse, it just feels, I'm sensing that it's a powerful story with probably lots is kind of what
Yes.
lots of meaning and perspective.
It's so funny you mentioned Lisa Phipps, because when she spoke with my young adult literature class a couple of semesters ago, and during that conversation, I learned that she began her career as a journalist. And what she talked about was how, as a journalist, you learn how to say many things in very few words because you have limited space. So you have to use an economy of words, but choose your words very, very carefully because every word counts. There can't be any extra words, right? And she talked about how that affected her as a poet, because poetry is sort of the same thing, is that the words are sparse. There's fewer of them on the page because in some cases, the white space, even around the poem, tells part of the story, right? So you have to make every word count. And I think that Waters and Latham did the same thing with this book too. You really get a sense of, there's 14 different characters and they all individually come to life for you. You know them as individual people because of the word choices that they use. They really did a masterful job of that. And I was really appreciative.
That's cool. Yeah, I think in your book talk, it conveyed that somehow. I got that sense that that would be the case. And it is interesting to hear Lisa's backstory. I didn't know that. So, but I felt the impact. Because each page I read of that book, I was like, wow, I'm feeling so much, but there were only this many words. Like, how did she do that? Now I know.
Yeah, it's magic. It's magic. These authors are magical. So I'm so grateful we have access to them. Even my dog.
Cool. Love it. Thanks for always bringing such great books. If you're looking to go to our past great books that we've talked about, check out bit.ly/read_this_now. You won't be disappointed.
That's it. And until next time, you all, thanks for tuning in and happy reading.